Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeoviking. Today, I am doing a video that I've intended to do for a long while. It's a video about a subject that is very important to the history of the field of archaeology, especially in the United States. And it is also a subject that is very much still important and relevant to talk about in the modern day. And that subject is the Mound Builder myth and its effect on the creation of pseudoarchaeology in the United States. So, first off, those of us in the who are watching this in the United States, when you hear the term the Mound Builder myth, I'm sure, or at least I assume, you immediately think of the mounds the within the United States, of which the United States is famous for, the Mississippian mounds, and archaic mounds such as Poverty Point. And you might be also be thinking, upon hearing the phrase the mound builder myth, being like, how is it a myth? We know that the Native Americans built the earthen mounds, or at least I hope that is what you immediately think of. And if that's the case, you are correct. The Native Americans most certainly are the ones, and unarguably are the ones who constructed the mounds, the earthen mounds, whether it be the Mississippian mounds, the Middle Woodland Hopewell mounds, or archaic mounds, etc. They are the ones who constructed them, such as you can see here on the screen, Monk's Mound from Cahokia. However, that's not what the mound builder myth is. I know it's counterintuitive, but the mound builder myth is something else. And so, with that in mind, we need to sort of define what the mound builder myth is. So, essentially, the mound builder myth is a 19th century CE, 1800s CE belief that the numerous earthwork mounds found across North America were not built by the ancestors of the contemporary North Americans, but by a lost, vanished race of superior people, usually ascribed to white Europeans or white Americans. And the myth has five basic arguments. One, that Native Americans were too primitive to have built the mounds and produced the works in stone, metal, and clay attributed to the mound builder culture. Um, actually, various mound builder cultures, but still, the mounds were and associated artifacts were claimed to have been older than even the ancestors of the Native Americans themselves. The myth claimed that stone tablets with European, Asian, and African inscriptions had been found in the mounds, and that Native Americans were not building mounds when Europeans arrived and had no idea who built the mounds. And finally, the myth claims that metal artifacts made from iron, silver, uh, or derived copper and other metal alloys had been found in the mounds. Now, to be fair, copper and bronze and other metals have been found associated with Native American cultures all throughout the United States and also the Americas as a whole, and even in some regions, iron objects and gold objects and silver objects, etc. That's not up for dispute, but it is important to note again that that's not necessarily what this myth is talking about. That being said, I did do a in-depth video on Native American metallurgy, both before and after European contact, that I will link in the icon. And then finally, it's important to note the myth is was and still is fueled by racism and a desire to justify the displacement and genocide of indigenous populations. And here's the source that I got all of these five basic arguments from. So, with that in mind, I also think it's important to point out that there is extensive archaeological evidence showing that the ancestors of the Native Americans migrated from East Asia and have been in the Americas for at least 23,000 years, if not more. And we know they did this from a variety of routes. The earliest coming from, or at least is thought to have come from, a sea route known as the Kelp Highway, where the ancestors of the Native Americans followed very closely to the coastline, feeding on marine resources until they eventually made it into North America and Central America and South America. And then the other route being the more famous Beringia or Bering Land Bridge. And again, this is not up for debate. We have papers like this published in Science talking about the ancient mitochondrial DNA proving the antiquity when the antiquity of the settling of the Americas, but also proving that Native Americans came here from East Asia, which you can see this graph here, this map here showing that. There's also this paper talking about a similar genomic study, looking at the population of Native Americans from Alaska and their connection to the settling of the Americas tens of thousands of years ago. And here's their data from that study, as well as here and here. Then there's another similar paper looking at the DNA of a individual from the Clovis culture in Montana and his connection to the peopling of the Americas tens of thousands of years ago. And then also this genomic study of the Ket people, a paleo Inuit or paleo Eskimo. Inuit's the correct term, but still paleo Eskimo related ethnic group within the Arctic of North America that had significant DNA suggesting to Eurasian and East Asian ancestry. And then in terms of evidence, like physical evidence, archaeological evidence of the Native American settlement of the Americas, the earliest, I can't say the earliest, but the best evidence that we have found in the past 10 years or so are the footprints in White Sands, Arizona, or sorry, New Mexico, which date to around 23,000 years ago, or even, maybe as late as 21,000 years ago. And then we also have large tool assemblages, such as the one at Cooper's Ferry in Idaho that dates to nearly 16,000 years ago, 15,785 years ago. And you'll notice a pattern. A lot of these articles are published in the journal Science or Science Advances. Then we have this article right here talking about pre-Clovis projectile points at the Deborah L. Friedkin site in Texas that date to between 13.5 to 15.5 thousand years ago. And then there's also extensive archaeological evidence of multiple cultural continuations after the ancestors of the Native Americans settled in the Americas, such as this paper right here talking about using 3D models to understand the changing role of fluting in Paleo-Indian point technology from the Clovis culture to the Dalton culture between 13,000 to 10,000 years ago. There's this paper published in the Journal of Archaeological Science talking about the Clovis, Folsom, and Midland components at the Deborah L. Friedkin site in Texas. There's this paper talking about the Clovis, Cumberland, and Dalton succession in the mid-south of the United States, Tennessee, and then also the northernmost parts of Georgia and Alabama. And there's this paper published in the Journal of Southeastern Archaeology talking about the age of the Dalton culture, which dates to around 13,000 to specifically 12,680 years ago to 10,700 years ago, but roughly 11,000, 13,000 years ago. There's this paper about an assessment of stone weapon tip standardization during the Clovis and Folsom transition in the Western United States. There's this paper about the Bayesian modeling of the Clovis and Folsom radiocarbon records, which indicates a 200-year transition period as the Clovis transitioned into the Folsom culture. And then there's this paper talking about, again, the Clovis Folsom transition towards the end of the Younger Dryas period. And then we also have archaeological evidence showing a near continuous tradition of mound construction in the eastern woodlands of North America across at least 6,000 years, starting specifically in the Middle Archaic period, roughly 6,500 to 3,000 BCE, and the Late Archaic period from roughly 3,000 to 1,000 BCE. And we can see this in the presence of mounds such as the Watkins Brake mounds in Louisiana, which date to roughly 5,400 to 5,000 years ago, which you can see those here and here. And then we have in Georgia shell ring mounds that date to around 4,500 to 3,800 years ago, with the shell ring mounds looking something like this. And they would have actually encompassed and encircled a village. And here's what they look like today. And here's another up close of that village. Then we also have the very famous Poverty Point mounds, as well as various other earthworks that date to around 3,500 years old. And here's a artist depiction of the ridges, I believe is what they are considered, that are artificial ridges created at the Poverty Point site. And then here is the main mound, and then there are smaller mounds here. And here is the main mound at Poverty Point. And I've actually been here. I've also been to Monk's Mound at Cahokia. Both are amazing mounds. I highly recommend anybody who, if you have a chance to go to these places, go to them. But again, here is Poverty Point, the main mound at Poverty Point. And here are is a depiction of the ridges, artificial ridges. And then we have mounds in the early woodland period, roughly 1000 to 200 BCE, and then the middle woodland period, roughly 200 BCE to 500 CE, where we find things such as the Adena mounds, which you can see here, as well as and talked about in this paper here, which you can again see here. You have the middle woodland mounds, such as Kolomoki, talked about in this journal here. With this mound dating to both the middle woodland and the late woodland periods, from roughly around 300 to 900 CE, maybe a little bit before. And you can see one of the mounds at Kolomoki here. And then we also have the Leak site in North Georgia, which was inhabited from roughly 300 BCE to 650 CE, which is talked about in this book here. And then we have the late woodland period from roughly 500 to 1,000 CE, and the Mississippian period from roughly 1,000 to the 1600 CE, though in some cases it extended, some parts of the country extended into the 1700s CE. And you have things such as, one thing that's important to point out is that during the late woodland period, there was some sort of decline in mound construction. It didn't completely go away, but it did decline. However, mound construction did resurge during the Mississippian period, and this was in part thanks to population growth within the late woodland period, as talked about in this paper here. And during the Mississippian period, this is where you begin to see the construction of the largest mound sites, with the exception of Poverty Point, which preceded it. But the largest mound sites, such as Cahokia, which is the largest Native American city north of Mexico, which is talked about in this chapter and book here. And this is, again, Monk's Mound here at Cahokia. Again, I highly recommend if you have the opportunity to go visit it. There is also here in Georgia, North Georgia specifically, the Etowah Mississippian Center, which has its own mounds, which is talked about in this journal here. And here are the three mounds at the Etowah site, which again I recommend go visiting this place. I live near this place for many years and visited many times, and it's a great place to visit. So before we get into the section that we have here, I do want to point out, for those of you who watched my previous videos, you know that I usually like to go in greater detail in whenever I present and talk about archaeological papers and academic papers. However, uh, that's not what I'm doing today. The reason I had all of these papers was mainly to show just the scope of archaeological research and evidence that is out there for people to examine and to show that it is indeed there and that we do have mountains of evidence proving the connection of the Native Americans to both the settlement of the antiquity of their settlement in the Americas and their connection to the various mounds throughout North America, and also the pyramids of, say, the Aztec and the Maya. Excuse me, I needed to take a sip of water. All right, so this brings us to our next section. The views of early explorers and scholars on the mounds between 1540 and 1832 CE. So, early on, many explorers and scholars from Europe and the United States actually acknowledged that the mounds were built by the Native Americans. Starting with Hernando de Soto, who during the Hernando de Soto expedition, the expedition would encounter multiple Native American villages with mounds. Um, and this expedition would happen between 1539 and 1542 CE. And in one of these encounters, De Soto's expedition, quote, went in procession up to the town, and they came after us. Having arrived at the town, we found that the caciques there were accustomed to have next to their houses where they live some very high mounds made by hand, and others have their houses on the mounds themselves. And here's the source that I got this from. And then we have John Bartram, the botanist John Bartram, who, while traveling through Florida, visited an abandoned village of the Timucua chiefdom, a Mississippian chiefdom. Uh, uh, and he visited this village on January 25th, 1766 CE. And while visiting this, in his account, Bartram states that at, quote, about noon, we landed at Mount Royal and went to an Indian tumulus, which was about 100 yards in diameter, nearly round, and nearly 20 foot high. Found some bones scattered on it. It must be very ancient, as live oaks are growing upon it 3 foot in diameter. What a prodigious multitude of Indians must have labored to raise it. To what height we can't say, as it must have settled much in such a number of years. And it is surprising where they brought the the sand from. Uh, that's supposed to be an S, and I apologize. But where they brought the sand from, and how, as they had nothing but baskets or bowls to carry it in. And here's the source that I got this from. And then in 1787 CE, seeking to determine the origins of the mounds, Thomas Jefferson would go on to excavate mounds near his plantation in Virginia. And after doing this, Jefferson would conclude that the mounds were built by Native Americans, and he would publish his results in his book called Notes on the State of Virginia. Uh, Jefferson would actually mention multiple hypotheses about the origins of the mounds, stating that, quote, some have thought they covered the bones of those who have fallen in battles, fought on the spot of internment. Some ascribe them to the custom said to prevail among the Indians of collecting at certain periods the bones of all their dead, wheresoever deposited at the time of death. Others again supposed them the general sepulchres for towns, conjectured to have been on or near these grounds, and this opinion was supported by the quality of the lands in which they are found, those constructed of earth being generally in the softest and most fertile meadow grounds on riversides, and by a tradition said to be handed down from the Aboriginal Indians, that when they settled in a town, the first person who died was placed erect and earth put about him, so as to cover and support him. That when another died, a narrow passage was dug to the first, the second reclined against him, and the cover of earth replaced him, and so on. There being one of these in my neighborhood, I wish to satisfy myself whether any and which of these opinions were just. For this purpose, I determined to open and examine it thoroughly. And here's the source that I got this excerpt from. Upon completing his examination of the mounds, Jefferson concluded that, quote, appearances certainly indicate that it has derived both origin and growth from the customary collection of bones and deposition of them together. That this first collection had been deposited on the common surface of the earth, a few stones put over it, and then covering of the earth. That the second had been laid on this had covered more or less of it in proportion to the number of bones, and was then also covered with earth, and so on. The following are the particular circumstances which give it this aspect. 1. The number of bones. 2. Their confused position. 3. Their being in different strata. 4. The strata in one part having no correspondence with those in another. 5. The different states of decay in those strata, which seem to indicate a difference in time of inhumation. 6. The existence of infant bones among them, but on whatever occasion may have been made, they are of considerable notoriety among the Indians. For a party passing about 30 years ago through the part of the country where this barrow is, went through the woods directly to it without any instruction or inquiry, and having stayed about it some time with expressions which were construed to be those of sorrow, they returned to the high road which they had left about half a dozen miles to pay this visit, and pursued their journey. So, in summation, he determined that these were likely fairly ancient, and that there was multiple stages of the mounds being built, and he determined from his interaction with Native Americans in the mounds, or at least his hearing about the this interaction between Native Americans and the mounds, that essentially these mounds were built by Native Americans. And then we have the account from United States General George Rogers Clark, which criticized the claims by the editor of the American magazine, Noah Webster, that the Native Americans did not build the mounds. Clark did this by writing a response to Webster and sending it to Matthew Carey, the editor of the newspaper The Museum. He did doing this in 1788 CE. Clark would then, doing this, would write that he one asked Native Americans something that, to my knowledge, nobody else had done, with the exception of course, DeSoto. And he would go on to state that, quote, the Indian traditions give an account of these works. They say they were the works of their forefathers, that they were as numerous as the trees in the wood, that they affronted the Great Spirit, and he made them kill one another. The works of the Mississippi near the Kaw River, Kaskaskia, are among the largest we know of. The Kaskaskia chief, Baptiste Duquois, I apologize if I butchered that, gave me a history of this. He said that was the palace of his forefathers when they covered the whole country and had large towns. That all these works we saw there were the fortifications around the town, which must have been very considerable. That the smaller works we saw so far within the larger comprehended the real palace. The little mountains we saw far flung within a basin on top was a tower that contained part of the guard belonging to the prince. As from the top of that height, they could defend the king's house from their arrows, etc. And here's the source I got this from. Clark would then go on to further state that, quote, I think the world is to blame to express such great anxiety to know who it was that built those numerous and formidable works, and what hath become of that people. They will find them in the Kaskaskias, Peorias, Cahokias, now extinct, Piankashas, Chickasaws, Cherokees, and such old nations who say they grew out of the ground where they live now, and that they were formerly as numerous as the trees in the woods. But affronting the Great Spirit, he made war among the nations, and they destroyed each other. This is their tradition, and I see no good reason why it should not be received as good history, at least as good as a great part of ours. So there you have it. Clark asked the Native Americans about the mounds, and then when they told them that their ancestors built the mounds, he took them at their word and said that everyone else should listen to them. So there is that. And here is the source that I got that information from. Unfortunately, um, reality is far more complex and dirty um, than how we would like to believe. Which leads us to the next section, the rise and height of the mound builder myth. So, despite the accounts of individuals such as De Soto and Jefferson, scholars in Europe and the United States began attributing the mounds to cultures from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Starting actually fairly early on, shortly after the Soto expedition, with people such as Portuguese rabbi Menashe ben Israel. It's important to note this is not his real name. This is a name he took upon himself. But either way, Menashe ben Israel would write a book called The Hope of Israel, where he claimed that Jews lived in the Americas prior to the arrival of Europeans. And he would write this book in 1650 CE. And then we have French American writer Michel Guillaume Jean de Crevecoeur, who would write a fictionalized account that claimed Benjamin Franklin believed the Inuit were descendants of Scandinavians and that the Native Americans of Florida and Louisiana were descendants of Tartars from Asia, Mongols essentially. And he would write this in 1787 CE with Crevecoeur, claiming that Franklin stated that, quote, those who inhabit the two Floridas, he replied, and lower Louisiana say that they came from the mountains of Mexico. I should be inclined to believe it if we may judge of the Esquimaux of the coast of Labrador, the most savage men known, by the fairness of their complexion, the color of their eyes, and their enormous beards. They are originally from the north of Europe, whence they came at a very remote period. As to the other nations of this continent, it seems difficult to imagine from what stock they can be descended, to assign them an Asiatic and Tartar origin, to assert they crossed Bering Straits and spread themselves over the continent, shocks all our notions of probability. How indeed can we conceive that men almost naked, armed with bows and arrows, could have undertaken a journey of 1,000 leagues through thick forest or impenetrable marshes, accompanied by their wives and children, with no means of subsistence save what they derived from hunting? What could have been the motives of such an immigration? Now, it is important to note that this account does not actually come from Franklin. In fact, no, in fact, there's no evidence that Franklin ever actually said this. This is just something that Crevecoeur, and I apologize if I'm butchering that, but this is something that Crevecoeur claimed that Franklin stated and believed. And here's the source that I got this from. And then we have white American botanist Benjamin Smith Barton, who claimed that the mound builders were Danes associated with the Norse colonization of Greenland and North America, with him specifically claiming this in his book Observations on Some Parts of Natural History that he wrote in 1787 CE. with Barton stating that, quote, these forts were built by the Danes, but I have not been able to learn at what period. From these circumstances, I am induced to think that the Danes have contributed to the peopling of America, and that the Toltecas, or whatever nation they may have been, that constructed the eminences and fortifications in that continent, were their descendants. I will not attempt to ascertain the area at which the Danes migrated to the New World. History, so far as I know, is silent on the subject, but we all know that long before the Northern invasion, their people were remarkable for their boldness and the extent of their voyages. They penetrated into Iceland, Greenland, and other parts of Europe, and nothing could obstruct the daring spirit which actuated them. So, essentially, the mound builders were European and white Scandinavian Europeans. And here's the source, or at least in the mind of Barton. Um, of course, that's not true. And here's the source that I got this information from. And then we have an individual I mentioned earlier, the editor Noah Webster, editor of the magazine American Museum, who claimed that the mounds were the work of ancient Europeans who had been wiped out by the Native Americans. With him making this claim in the magazine American Museum on sometime in July 1790 CE. With Webster actually posing his claim as a question, asking, quote, what will the public say of the following opinions that the southern Indians in Mexico and Peru are descended from the Carthaginian Mediterranean nations who found their way to the continent at a very early period and spread themselves over North as well as South America, that these nations had become more civilized than the present northern Indians, though not acquainted with the use of iron at a late period of time, perhaps 4 or 5 centuries ago, the Siberian Tartars found their way to the northwest parts of this country and pushed their settlements till they met the southern and more ancient settlers that, accustomed to a colder climate and more active and hardy at life, they were the Goths and Vandals of North America, and drove the more ancient settlers from their territory, that in the contest between these nations, between these different tribes or races of men, were constituted the numerous fortifications discovered on the Ohio, the northern loams, and in all parts of the Western Territory. What facts may be found to support this idea must be left to further investigation. So, the um, again, uh, the mound builders, according to Webster, were white Europeans. And here's the source that I got this information from. And then we have Caleb Atwater, who would conduct limited excavations on of the mounds in Ohio and other western states. He would then claim the mounds were divided into three types: those built by modern Europeans, those built by modern Native Americans, and those built by mysterious mound builder peoples that he believed were Hindus from India. It's important to note that this belief that in the Hindus from India, it was not like it was connected to the sort of Nazi belief in the Aryan race from India. You know, the belief that the Aryans or the Aryan race from India was a white culture. Now, of course, that's not the case. The Indo-Aryans were Central Asians who came into India and intermarried with the pre-existing indigenous peoples of the Indian subcontinent. And so, of course, no European uh, groups came in there. It was all Asian, but whatever. That's not the point. The point is this belief in Hindus from India coming to North America is very much just essentially the same as the white Aryan race that the Nazis believed in. Uh, with that in mind, Atwater would publish his results in the book known as Description of Antiquities Discovered in the State of Ohio and Other Western States, specifically publishing this book in 1820 CE. Then we have Andrew Jackson, who would use the Mound Builder myth as justification for his Indian Removal Act, specifically giving a speech on December 7th, 1830 CE, where Jackson stated that, quote, humanity has often wept over the fate of the Aborigines of this country, and philanthropy has been long busily employed in devising a means to avert it. But its progress has never for a moment been arrested. One by one have many powerful tribes disappeared from the earth to follow the tomb, uh, to the tomb, the last of his race, and to tread on the graves of extinct nations, excite melancholy reflections. But true philanthropy reconciles the mind to these vicissitudes, as it does to the extinction of one generation to make room for another. In the monuments and fortresses of an unknown people spread over the extensive regions of the West, we behold the memorials of a once powerful race which was exterminated or has disappeared to make room for the existing savage tribes. Nor is there anything in this which, upon a comprehensive view of the general interest of the human race, is to be regretted. Philanthropy could not wish to see this continent restored to the condition in which it was found by our forefathers. What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged with by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with all the improvements which art can devise or industry can execute, occupied by more than 12 millions of happy people and filled with the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion. So, here we have, as I already said, but it's important to drive home. Here we have an example of United States politicians like Andrew Jackson using the Mound Builder myth to justify the genocide of Native Americans. And here's the source that I got this speech from. And then in 1836 CE, French biologist Constantin Samuel Rafinesque would forge a document known as the Wallam Olam, claiming that it was the historical narrative of the Lenape Nation, which supposedly described the Lenape Nation as arriving in the Americas and wiping out a white civilization that was present in the Americas before the arrival of the Lenape. Rafinesque would again publish this forgery in his first volume of The American Nations in 1836 CE. And then in 1848 CE, we would see Ephraim George Squire and Edwin Hamilton Davis conduct systematic excavations and surveys of hundreds of mounds, where they would then go on to claim Native Americans were not capable of producing mounds, with Squire and Davis publishing their results in the Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. Uh, and then in 1858 CE, white American archaeologist William Pigeon would forge archaeological evidence of an elaborate network of coded earthen symbols used by an ancient race that supposedly predated the Native Americans, which he claimed was Danish in origin and warred with the Toltecs, but had since been destroyed through intermarriage with the Toltecs, which destroyed the civilization's pure white blood. There's the racism I talked about, the Mound Builder myth being connected to, or way at the beginning of the video. Pigeon also claimed to have interviewed one of the last survivors of the civilization, a man named De Kuda, and Pigeon would then publish his hoax and forgery in the book titled Traditions of De Kuda and Antiquarian Researches. And then that brings us to our next section, the Mound Builder myth and the Lost Tribes of Israel, which is the Lost Tribes of Israel is a subject that is one of the most connected subjects to the Mound Builder myth, mainly through white religious leader Joseph Smith, who claimed in his Book of Mormon that the Native Americans were the descendants of members of the Lost 10 Tribes of Israel, who had originally been white before being cursed with dark skin for disloyalty to God. And he would first make this claim in his first edition of the Book of Mormon in 1830 CE. Similar to Joseph Smith, white American polemicist Josiah Priest would publish in his book American Antiquities and Discoveries in the West which would claim that the ancestors of Native Americans were the lost 10 tribes of Israel, with him publishing this in 1833 CE. Then in 1838 CE in Moundsville, Virginia, which would eventually become West Virginia, uh, local white American physician James Clemens would then forge a stone with Hebrew words and would plant the stone in an archaeological excavation. Upon discovery, the stone was dubbed the Newark Stone and was used as proof for the Mound Builder myth. Similarly, in 1860 CE, multiple stone artifacts were faked with Hebrew writing on them, possibly by white American archaeologist David Wyrick, who possibly planted them in archaeological investigations. I should point out, it's still not sure whether or not Wyrick actually did this, but he's the most likely individual to do it. And then upon discovery, Wyrick would use the artifacts as proof of the Mound Builder myth. Among the stones were the so-called Newark Keystone, seen on the left, which contained Hebrew phrases referring to God, and the Decalogue stone on the right, which contained the Ten Commandments. Now, that being said, despite attempts to use these three stones as proof for the Mound Builder myth, several scholars from the United States were able to determine that they were fakes, such as geologist Charles Whittlesey, who examined the Newark stones and stated that, quote, the stone had not the appearance of great antiquity, but suggested that it might have been buried 50 years. The Freemasons of Newark at once recognized it as one of their emblems, representing the keystone of an arch which Master Masons wore in early times as an insignia of their rank. He later concludes that, quote, the Grave Creek inscription, if it was gotten up by the proprietor, Mr. Tom Lunso, might be placed in the same category as is more probable. It was the work of another party who must have industriously studied the runic or Bardic alphabet. It can only be attributed to an innate pleasure in the practice of deception amounting to monomania. We have frequent exhibitions of this disease in the case of articles presented to our museum, in some instances by persons who profess to be respectful and conscientious. So, in sum, Charles Whittlesey was not impressed at all by these objects and pretty much immediately was like, no, these are fake. Um, and then we also have Jewish scholar Dr. Abraham Geiger, who stated that, quote, since the supposition that these are forgeries is scarcely admissible, it is worth the while of investigation for scientific reasons to devote attention to the interpretation of these stones. And later, after careful examination of photos of the objects, Geiger concluded that the stones, quote, they were the bungling work of an unskilled stonemason, and the strangeness of some letters as well as the many mistakes and transpositions was his fault. The letters are not antique. This is not a relic of hoary antiquity, nor is it of historical critical value for the Decalogue. I am unable to determine when or for what purpose this work of religious hocus pocus was produced. So again, much like Whittlesey, Jewish scholar Abraham Geiger Dr. Abraham Geiger was not at all impressed and was able to pretty easily determine they were fake. And here's the source that I got this information from. Then we have the connection of the mound builder myth to giants, or to the myth of giants. And this is because many white Americans and United States politicians began to associate the mounds with giants, often the giants mentioned in the Bible, the Nephilim. Uh, a good example of this is Abraham Lincoln, who early in his political career claimed in a political speech that the bones of giants filled the mounds. He made this speech sometime between September 25th and 30th, 1848 CE. And in this speech, Lincoln described the giants in reference to the age of Niagara Falls, stating that, quote, it calls up the indefinite past, when Columbus sought this continent, when Christ suffered on the cross, when Moses led Israel through the Red Sea, nay, even when Adam first came from the hand of his Maker. Then as now, Niagara was roaring here. The eyes of that species of extinct giants, whose bones fill the mounds of America, have gazed on Niagara as ours do now. Contemporary with the whole race of men, and older than the first man, Niagara is strong and fresh today as 10,000 years ago. The mammoth and mastodon, now so long dead, that fragments of their monstrous bones alone testify they ever lived, have gazed on Niagara. In that long time, never still for a single moment, never dried, never froze, never slept, never rested. So essentially, in the view of Lincoln, the giants from the Bible were in the Americas and responsible for the mounds. And here's the source that I got this information from. And then we have another example from the autobiography of Texas Ranger Nelson Lee, who claimed to have heard a story about an ancient race of white giants from a Comanche elder named the Rolling Thunder. However, it is important to note the Rolling Thunder and other members of the Comanche did not corroborate Nelson's story, and also, to my knowledge, no member of the Comanche Nation till this day corroborates it. Um, and he published this autobiography in 1859 CE. And in his account, Nelson stated that Rolling Thunder said that, quote, innumerable moons ago, a race of white men 10 feet high, far more rich and powerful than any white people living now, here inhabited a large range of country, extending from the rising to the setting sun. Their fortifications crowned the summits of the mountains, protecting their populous cities situated in the intervening valleys. They excelled every other nation which has flourished, either before or since, in all manner of cunning handicraft, were brave and warlike, ruling over the land they had wrested from its ancient possessors with high and haughty hand. Compared with them, the pale faces of the present day were as pygmies, both in arts and arms. They drove the Indians from their homes, putting them to the sword, occupying the valleys in which their fathers had dwelt before them since the world began. At length, in the height of their power and glory, when they remembered justice and mercy no more, and became proud and lifted up, the Great Spirit descended from above, sweeping them with fire and deluge from the face of the earth. The mounds we had seen on the table lands were remnants of their fortresses, and the crumbling ruins that surrounded us all that remained of a mighty city. In like manner, continued Rolling Thunder, the day will surely come when the present white race, which is driving the Indians before it, despoiling them of their inheritance, and which, in confidence of its strength, has become arrogant and boastful and forgotten God, uh, will be swept from existence. For the Great Spirit is just, and as certainly as the rivers flow downward towards the salt sea, and the sun rises in the morning and sets at night, so certainly will he yet restore the land of their fathers to the red man when the days of this affliction are past. Now, um, reading this account, uh, now this I want to preface this. This is my own opinion, but reading this account, there's two options here. And both of them lead me to believe that. Sorry, one of them is that Nelson completely made up this account to make himself look good for whatever reason, um, which I think is very likely in the most likely scenario. But the second option is if the Rolling Thunder did, well, one, if the Rolling Thunder existed, and two, if the Rolling Thunder told him this story, it reads very much like the Great Flood from the Bible. And so, um, if he did exist and did tell the story, he may very well have been using the story as sort of a way to get his point across that the the white Americans and white Europeans were amoral uh, and wrong for what they were doing to the Native Americans and the Comanche. Now, I will also say again, I think the more likely scenario is that Nelson Lee made up the story. Again, and again, that goes back to the fact that this sounds very much like the biblical flood from the Genesis, and an individual who would be far more likely to be aware of the biblical flood from the Genesis would be a white American or white European, such as Nelson Lee. But whichever one it is, either way, it's very, very probably not a true account. And then we have an event where deep skeptic William C. Stubb Newell hired a crew to carve a giant out of a large block of gypsum, where he would then weather it with stains and acids, and would have the giant buried in Cardiff, New York, on the farm of his cousin William Newell. And Hull specifically did this to prove how easy it could be to trick people into believing in hoaxes. And he did this in 1868 CE. Then, sometime between October 16th and December 1869 CE, the giant would be discovered by Newell, who would then proceed to charge tourists to see what he, locals, and tourists thought was a were genuine giant remains. And then Newell would eventually sell the giant to a syndicate in New York for $23,000, roughly $572,000 when adjusted for inflation. Uh, Also during this time, P.T. Barnum would attempt to purchase the giant multiple times from this syndicate and fail. And in response, Barnum would make his own giant and would claim that his is was the original, and that the other one was a forgery. And he would do this sometime in December of 1869 CE. Eventually, however, Hull would confess to the press that the giant was a fake and stated that he did so to expose the tendency of the Christian community to believe in things too easily and to counter the fundamentalist belief that giants once roamed the earth. However, despite Hull's attempts, many people would continue to believe in the existence of giants, and Barnum would quite successfully continue to claim that his was authentic and would continue to make money off of it. And Holwood is specifically make his confession on December 10th, 1869 CE. And then we have an account from the autobiography of William F. Cody, more commonly known as Buffalo Bill, where he claimed to have been shown the remains of a giant by members of the Pawnee Nation. However, again, much like Nelson Lee's account, this account was not, and I believe to this day is still not corroborated by any member of the Pawnee Nation. Uh, and also, this is further exasperated by the fact that we need to remember and consider that Buffalo Bill was known for fabricating stories for money and fame. I mean, after all, he created the Wild West Circus, which was highly sensationalized in itself. But with that in mind, in his autobiography, Bill stated that, quote, while we were in the Sandhills scouting the Niobrara country, the Pawnee Indians brought into camp one night some very large bones, one of which a surgeon of the expedition pronounced to be the thigh bone of a human being. The Indians claimed that the bones they had found were those of a person belonging to a race of people who, a long time ago, lived in this country, that they were once a race of men on the earth whose size was about 3 times that of an ordinary man, and they were so swift and powerful that they could run along the side of a buffalo and take the animal in one arm and could tear off a leg and eat the meat as they walked. These giants denied the existence of a great spirit, and when they heard the thunder or saw lightning, they laughed at it and said they were greater than either. This pleased the Great Spirit that he caused a great rainstorm to come, and the water kept rising higher and higher, so that it drove those proud and conceited giants from the low grounds of the hills and thence to the mountains. But at last, even the mountain tops were submerged, and those mammoth men were all drowned. After the flood had subsided, the Great Spirit came to the conclusion that he had made man too large and powerful, and they would therefore correct the mistake by creating a race of men of smaller size and less strength. That this is the reason, say the Indians, that the modern men are so small and not like the giants of old, and they claim this story is a matter of Indian history, which has been handed down among them from time immemorial. Again, you'll note the striking similarity with Buffalo Bill's account with that of the biblical flood from Genesis, the book of Genesis, which again suggests that uh, Buffalo Bill made up this story uh, based on the biblical flood in the Bible, and that this is not an account at all from the Pawnee Nation. And if it was, which again, it's very unlikely that it is, but if it was an account that they were attempting to use to make a point about how wrong and amoral the white Americans were and what how wrong their actions were to the Native Americans. And then we also have multiple New York Times articles, with the New York Times running articles describing the supposed discovery of remains of giants and mounds, such as one article published uh, on April 5th, 1886 CE, and another article published on December 20th, 1897 CE, with the article from 1886 CE talking about supposed giant bones being found in a mound in Cartersville, Georgia, and North Georgia. And then the one from 1897 CE talking about supposed giant remains being found in a mound in Wisconsin. And then there's also many, many more. That being said, it's important to note that despite the New York Times publishing these articles about the discovery of giant remains, Times journalist Augustus Maverick admitted that any article about giants was sensational and was a fake article made solely for entertainment. And he made this claim in 1870 CE, specifically in an autobiography about Times co-founder Henry Jarvis Raymond, where Augustus stated that, quote, in time of peace, newspaper hoaxes are of the mild type, inoffensive affairs, which please the fancy of the reader or justify the employment of capital letters in three-line headings. Of this class are the stories of wild men prowling in the woods, of sea serpents disporting in the placid waters of remote lakes, of marvelous discoveries of hidden treasures, or of revelation of ancient relics, all of which may be taken with grains of salt. And I think this is a very important thing to point out, because a lot of people who in the modern day who believe in the mound builder myth and believe in the existence of giants in the Americas oftentimes quote articles from the New York Times in the 1800s. But as you can see here, coming from a journalist who worked at the New York Times during this period, these articles were fake articles made solely for the purpose of entertainment. Excuse me. Needed a sip of water. And then we have our next section, the Mound Builder Myth and Atlantis. And this is something important to point out, because many European and white Americans began to associate the mounds with the myth of Atlantis, such as Lafcadio Hearn, a Greek and Irish writer who wrote in the Cincinnati, Ohio newspaper, The Commercial, that he believed that the mound builders were people from the lost continent of Atlantis, specifically citing the Serpent Mound of Ohio as proof of an Atlantean cult worshiping the serpent from the Garden of Eden. And he would make this claim in 1876 CE. And then the individual who had the most impact and was the most influential on the connection of Atlantis with the Mound Builder myth was United States Congressman Ignatius Donnelly, who published the book Atlantis, the Antediluvian World in 1882 CE, and then followed up with another book, Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Gravel, in 1883 CE. In both books, Donnelly claimed that the mounds, along with the pyramids of the Maya and the Aztec, were constructions of an ancient white Atlantean civilization that existed in the Americas before being destroyed in a cataclysmic flood. with the survivors of the civilization being the ancestors of the white Aryan race and all Europeans. Again, you'll note a pattern here, the biblical connections to a cataclysmic flood, like the biblical flood. And then we also have Russian mystic Helena Blavatsky, who wrote in her book The Secret Doctrine that the Aryan race came from Atlantis, and that the mounds were objects built by Aryan Atlanteans before being wiped out by God in the biblical flood in 1888 CE. Again, I cannot stress this enough. There is a pattern here. Now this leads us to our next section, the decline and temporary fall of the mound builder myth. So the decline of the mound builder myth began as archaeological evidence increasingly showed that Native Americans built the mounds. And we can see this in the works of individuals such as Samuel Foster Haven, who concluded in his book, Archaeology of the United States, that the mounds were objects built by the ancestors of Native Americans. And he specifically made this claim in his book in 1856 CE. And then in 1879 CE, John Wesley Powell would create the Bureau of American Ethnology to study Native American cultures. And he would specifically hire Cyrus Thomas to conduct systematic excavations of thousands of mounds. Upon doing this, Thomas concluded that the mound builder myth was false and that the mounds were objects built by Native Americans and their ancestors. And he would publish his findings in the report, in the book, the Report on the Mound Explorations of Bureau Ethnology in 1894 CE. And this will be the absolutely the most comprehensive series of excavations, and he himself would employ hundreds of archaeologists to conduct this work as well. Thanks to the work of Thomas and other archaeologists, the mound builder myth would fall out of favor in academia. However, it never fully disappeared. Which brings us to our last section, our next section, the resurgence of the myth of the mound builder myth. So the mound builder myth would resurge in popularity outside of academia and would actually begin to evolve by adding new facets, such as the addition of aliens as proposed builders of the mounds. We can see one of the earliest examples of this in the writings of H.P. Lovecraft, who would write a novella titled The Mound about an archaeologist discovering that the mounds had been built by an ancient race of aliens who were still living deep below the mounds and not Native Americans, which is not a surprise given that H.P. Lovecraft was a rabid racist. And he would specifically. Okay, let me clarify something here. He wrote this novella before 1940 CE. However, he died shortly after he finished it, so it wasn't actually officially published until 1940 CE. So 1940 CE is the official publication date, but it is important to note he wrote it a couple of years beforehand. On top of that, the mound builder myth, especially the versions of the myth advocated by Donnelly and Blavatsky, in part inspired the philosophy of the Nazi Party. Now, of course, they weren't the only inspirations, but they were most certainly very large inspirations for the Nazi Party. And this would especially influence the organization in charge of Nazi archaeological expeditions, the Honorba, who conduct archaeological excavations and expeditions between 1935 and 1947 CE. Yes, that's right. The Honorba actually existed for a couple of years after the end of World War II. So that's something to some unfortunate information that needs to be known about. And then in 1968 CE, Swiss hotel manager. Yes, he's a hotel manager and not an archaeologist. Sorry, Ancient Aliens fans. But anyways, Swiss hotel manager Erich von Däniken would claim in his book Chariots of the Gods that all ancient monuments, especially those belonging to non-white indigenous groups, were the product of aliens rather than the product of non-white indigenous groups who claimed heritage to them. Von Däniken would actually heavily cite the Bible's reference to giants and Spanish accounts claiming to be called white gods by Aztecs. And in fact, von Däniken invalidates the achievements of non-white indigenous groups repeatedly in the book. At one point, when confronted with the possibility that the Nazca lines in Peru could be part of the Inca road system, von Däniken stated that, quote, or states that, quote, the archaeologists say that they are Inca roads, a preposterous idea. Of what use to the Inca were roads that ran parallel to each other, that intersected, that were laid out in a plain and came to a sudden end? Which, okay, so one thing. While von Däniken is correct that the Nazca lines were not Inca roads as they predated, or yeah, predate the Inca road system, he completely ignored and continues to ignore the fact that the Inca did indeed have roads. Also, as I was reading this, it just sort of baffled me, him asking like, why, what would they have used for roads that run parallel to each other or intersect? So have you never heard of like intersections? I know for a fact intersections and four-way stops and such exist, but in multiple countries, including Europe and the United States, and also in multiple countries, including in Europe and the United States, roads run parallel with each other. Not all of them, but there are roads that most certainly run parallel with each other. So it's sort of it's just sort of odd. And also like, oh, they were laid out and came to a sudden end. Yeah, dead end roads again exist in multiple countries. So the logic is just all over the place as it is. But then, he goes on to say, um, uh, one thing, it's odd that he says that the Inca had no need of roads, but he also goes on to say that the lines could only have been constructed under the supervision of aliens, stating that, quote, in that case, what purpose did the lines of at Nazca serve? According to my way of thinking, they could have been laid out on their gigantic scale, uh, by working from a model and using a system of coordinates, or they could have also been built according to the instructions from an aircraft. It is not yet possible to say with certainty whether the plain of Nazca was ever an airfield. If iron was used, it will still certainly not be found because there is no prehistoric iron. Metals corrode in a few years. Stone never corrodes. What is wrong with the idea that the lines were laid out uh, to say to the gods, land here? Everything has been prepared as you ordered. The builders of geometrical figures may have had no idea what they were doing, but perhaps knew perfectly well what the gods needed in order to land. So again, very much like the Mound Builder myth, claims the Native Americans, in this case the Nazca, were not capable of building complex structures, um, whether it be mounds or the Nazca lines, and they could have only done so with outside help, or it could have only have been done by non by individuals who are not Native Americans or other non-white indigenous groups. And here's the source that I got this from. Von Däniken also cites biblical accounts of giants as evidence for aliens visiting humanity in ancient times, with Von Däniken at one point asking, quote, who can tell us what sons of God took the daughters of man to wife? Ancient Israel had a single sacrosanct God. Where do the sons of God come from? They were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, they bore children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Genesis chapter 6, paragraph 4. Uh, Once again, we have the sons of God who interbreed with human beings. Here, too, we have the first mentions of giants. Giants keep on cropping up in all parts of the globe, in the mythology of East and West, in the sagas of Tiwanaku, in the epics of the Eskimos. Giants haunt the pages of almost all ancient books, so they must have existed. What sort of creatures were they, these giants? Were they our forefathers who built the gigantic buildings and effortlessly men handled the monoliths? Or were they technically skilled space travelers from another star. One thing is certain, the Bible speaks of giants, describes them as sons of gods, and these sons uh, of God breed with the daughters of men and multiply. So again, uh, much like the Mound Builder myth states, the Native Americans and non-white indigenous peoples couldn't build complex structures like mounds, pyramids, etc. It had to have been built by some outside force, whether it be aliens, white Europeans, or giants. And here is the source here that I got this information from. Then in 1981 CE, we saw the premiere of Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, which helped spark the conspiracy theory that the Smithsonian was hiding biblical artifacts and the remains of giants from the public, specifically the very famous ending scene of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the Ark of the Covenant is being carted away into some large warehouse. Now, it's important to note this is not the origin of this conspiracy theory, but it certainly helped sort of increase this conspiracy theory and make it more popular. And then in 1995 CE, British journalist Graham Hancock claimed in his book Fingerprints of the Gods that non-white civilizations descend from a white Atlantis-like civilization that resided in the Americas before being destroyed by a cataclysmic flood. Again, you're seeing a pattern. And in this book, Hancock cites Ignatius Donnelly as one of his inspirations and uses Spanish accounts of Native Americans' supposed worship of white gods as evidence for his hypothesis. And in terms of his citing Donnelly, Hancock pays tribute to Donnelly, stating that, quote, "Finally, I want to pay tribute to Ignatius Donnelly, Arthur Posnansky, R.A. Schweller de Lubisque, Charles Hapgood, and Giorgio de Santillana. Investigators who saw that something was badly wrong with the history of mankind, who had the courage to speak out against intellectual adversity, who pioneered the momentous paradigm shift that is now irrevocably underway." So, for anybody who uh, has tried to claim that Hancock was not inspired. Graham Hancock, who's still doing his thing, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but for all of you who have tried to claim that Hancock was not inspired by Ignatius Donnelly, yes, he was, in his own words. And then in terms of the Spanish accounts of supposed worship of white gods, Hancock cites Spanish accounts of white gods multiple times in his book, at one point stating that, quote, "As we shall see, the records confirmed this was exactly the appearance ascribed to Viracocha by those who worshipped him. Whoever he was, therefore, he could not have been an American Indian. They are relatively dark-skinned people with sparse facial hair. Viracocha's bushy beard and pale complexion made him sound like a Caucasian. Back in the 16th century, the Incas had thought so too. Indeed, their legends and religious beliefs made them so certain of his physical type that they initially mistook the white bearded Spaniards who arrived on their shores for the returning Viracocha and his demigods, an event long prophesied, which Viracocha was said in all legends to have promised. This happy coincidence gave Pizarro's conquistadors the divisive strategic and psychological edge that they needed to overcome the numerically superior Inca forces in the battle that followed, who had provided the model for the Viracochas. Later, Hancock reiterates his belief in the Spanish accounts of white gods by stating that, quote, "Meanwhile, however, I was keen to pursue another related line of inquiry. This concerned the bearded white-skinned deity named Quetzalcoatl, who was believed to have sailed to Mexico from across the seas in remote antiquity. Quetzalcoatl was created with the invention of advanced mathematical and calendrical formulae that the Maya were later to use to calculate the date of doomsday." So, as you can see here, Hancock, one believes that these myths are true. Of course, the these myths are not true. These accounts are not true. All historic accounts show that from the Spanish conquest show that the Inca and also the Aztec and other people who uh, are, some people believed the Spaniards were gods. These accounts show that they did not believe that, and that they fairly quickly were like very willing to defend themselves against the Spanish conquistadors. But it's clear from these things that Hancock very much believes these accounts and believes that they are proof that a white white European race came to the Americas and taught the Native Americans how to build civilization. Very much like the idea in the Mound Builder myth that white Europeans were the ones responsible for the construction of the mounds. And then also, Hancock mentions Donnelly's antediluvian races multiple times, at one point stating that, quote, in the Puranic version of the universal flood story, shortly before the deluge was unleashed, the fish god Vishnu warned his human protege that he should conceal the sacred scriptures in safe place to preserve the knowledge of the antediluvian races from destruction. And then here are the sources that I got this information from. And also, Hancock cites Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, repeatedly, which you can see examples of here on page 56 and 57, which you can see here. And then in chapter 14 on page 106 and 107, which you can see here. Which again, anybody who tries to claim that Donnelly doesn't take inspiration from, Donnelly tries to claim that Hancock doesn't take inspiration from Donnelly. Yes, he does. Uh, and then later on, the beliefs of von Däniken and Hancock would eventually become popular pseudo-archaeological TV shows, such as Ancient Aliens and Ancient Apocalypse, both of which downplay and outright ignore the achievements of non-white indigenous groups. And I've already done a series of debunking videos on Ancient Aliens and Ancient Apocalypse. And I will include that series debunking these shows, the playlist specifically in the iCard. Same goes for this, where disgraced geologist Scott Wolter used the Mound Builder myth to downplay the achievements of non-white indigenous groups in his TV show America Unearthed, which ran from 2012 to 2015 CE. And Actually, let me go back. I do want to state that again. I did a video debunking some of Volter's beliefs in his show, and I will include that in the same playlist in the iCard as the Ancient Aliens and Ancient Apocalypse series. And then running, I believe, just for 2014, was a show on the History Channel, which was, of course, now a very unreliable network, much like America Unearthed and Ancient Aliens, which also ran on the History Channel. The History Channel would create the show The Search for the Lost Giants, which was dedicated to the myth of giants in the Americas. And again, I believe it only ran for about a year. I could be wrong, but I believe, to my knowledge, that's only about how long it ran. Then in 2013 CE, white supremacist Kyle Bristow would write a novel titled White Apocalypse about a race of white Solutreans being wiped out in the Ice Age by the Beringians, the people he claimed were the savage ancestors of Native Americans. Bristow used the Solutrean hypothesis, an outdated and debunked archaeological hypothesis claiming Solutreans from Europe settled the Americas before Native Americans to justify his racism and belief that Native Americans should be exterminated. Bristow specifically dedicated his book to the, quote, real Native Americans, who he believes are white people. In fact, Bristow's book would be praised by other white supremacist leaders, such as Billy Roper, of White Resistance, and Kevin Alfred Storm of National Vanguard. And it would be also praised by Canadian white supremacist Paul Fromm, who praised Bristow's book, stating that, quote, Kyle Bristow's novel, dedicated to North America's real Native Americans, Europeans who have been here for more than 15,000 years, is a soaring inspirational dramatization of our people, taking our continent back from the Third World invaders, from the very first cathartic scene in which the protagonist dispatches a gang of Hispanic thugs seeking to murder his family. I felt I was reading the actualization of Rudyard Kipling's insightful poem, The Wrath of the Awakened Saxon. So, as you can see again, here is that connection to racism in the Mound Builder myth that I talked about way at the beginning of the video, and the connection to the belief that the mounds were built by white Europeans. And here's that source here that I got this from. And then also, we have Frank of Queens, the white supremacist host of the podcast The Right Perspective, who created a holiday that he calls World Salutrian Day. And on his podcast, Frank posted a comment promoting his new holiday, stating that, quote, you can thank TRP for carrying the article. We've been telling you for years and have done so unapologetically. It is not America, but Northern Great Salutria. Southern Great Salutria is the correct name for Southern America. Our people were here first. We were murdered in a horrific act of genocide by the invading Beringians. We were here first, and those who don't like it, well, get over it. Our great white Salutrian ancestors came here not 1,000 years ago, but more like 30,000 years ago. Medcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania proves this overwhelmingly. The reason that the incredible savage Mesoamerican Maya pressed and elongated the skull of the royalty was because of the race of memory of the great white gods, who we know to be our great white Salutrian ancestors. Think of it. How many tens of thousands of years were our people here? It took thousands for them to traverse the continent and come to the Columbian River in Kennewick, Washington State. There were no horses to carry them. They walked. Our ancestor, the Kennewick man, was brutally slaughtered by the Beringians and his people also. They found a spear point in his hip. Please tune in to The Right Perspective on the week of April 20th for World Salutrian Day. Please tell your children that our great white Salutrian ancestors settled this land and were destroyed. Ours were a peaceful people who welcomed the Beringians in peace and were paid back in death. They left little trace because they honored nature and lived lightly on the land. Their great cities were organic entities that blended with nature, not against it. They had no word for war, but were a kind, peaceful, gentle, loving people. Our elders teach us this. You must teach others. One people, one culture, one race. Remember the Beringians teach of great white gods who taught the arts of civilization to them. These are the history of Salutrian ancestors told in myth. The proof is here as it always was, but it is being suppressed. Mexico will find more Salutrian proof. The proof won't be buried as it is happening here. They aren't PC idiots who were afraid of to offend the Beringians. Civilizations build upon the older ones. Thus as ever, it is proved. So therefore, I predict that within the Mexico Valley, where Mexico City is, they will one day find the remains of a vast Salutrian city. Our ancestors have slept for tens of thousands of years, but their voices won't be stilled. The myth of Atlantis and the story of the Garden of Eden are right beneath our feet. Those who returned to Europe told of the wondrous land beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Ars Lutria. It was a paradise, the Garden of Eden. No war, no famine, no hatred. A land of incredible peace and plenty of all. Hail Salutria. It is the real Atlantis. Which, of course, is, if you've seen any of my archaeology videos, about the history of Native Americans, or even seen the beginning of this video, um, about the mountain of evidence of archaeological evidence showing that Native Americans were indeed the first people here. As you can see, this account is absolutely false. It's nothing. It's just nonsense and gibberish, created to by a racist to justify his beliefs that white people should commit further horrific genocide against Native Americans. And here is again the source that I got this from. All right, now let's bring this to our last section, concluding thoughts. So, why is the mound builder myth dangerous? Well, one, the mound builder myth is an outdated hypothesis that is not corroborated by any archaeological evidence whatsoever. The mound builder myth erases the history and achievements of any ancient culture that isn't white and European. Um, Three, the mound builder myth both implies and often outright states, depending on the source you're looking at, that non-white indigenous groups are incapable of building complex structures such as cities, civilizations, etc., and are instead only capable of violence and barbarism, all of which is contradicted by the wealth of archaeological evidence. The mound builder myth promotes distrust of education and promotes the belief in extreme fringe conspiracy theories connected to racism and bigotry. Uh, the mound builder myth promotes the spread of misinformation for profit and entertainment over educational content that society can benefit from, and allows and incentivizes con men such as von Däniken, Hancock, and Walter to swindle the general public for their own monetary gain. And finally, the mound builder myth is a tool used by white supremacists both in the past and the present to justify the genocide of non-white indigenous groups. And here are all the sources that I got this information from. And I really wish I could end it on a more positive light. But unfortunately, these are the facts. And I will say that archaeologists like myself are very much combating this mound builder myth and all the various other pseudoarchaeological theories connected to it. I mean, I'm doing it. Many Minuteman's doing it. Uh, Flint and Dibble's doing it, etc. So I will say that archaeologists are doing it, but unfortunately, uh, this myth is also probably not going anywhere anytime soon. So how I want to end the video is I want to say I hope that all of you watching use this video to one to educate yourselves, but two, use this video to educate others and use this video as inspiration to learn more about both the accurate archaeology of Native Americans and other civilizations throughout the world. And also use this video to combat the mound builder myth in whatever way you can, because archaeologists are again doing a lot of work to combat it, but we can't do it all ourselves. The public has to also push back against it as well. And I know that's a lot to ask in the grand scheme of things, but it's very important. And again, I will, for my part, continue pushing back against and fighting against this myth. But I again hope that you will also push back and fight against it. So with that, I'm going to end the video. Thank you everyone for watching. And if you would like to see me discuss any of the subjects I talked about in this video in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.